The bright lights of the studio hummed overhead, reflecting off the sleek, polished surface of the news desk. The set was a familiar one of the most watched primetime political talk shows in the country. Millions of viewers tuned in every night, expecting fiery debates, sharp-tongued exchanges, and the occasional viral moment. Tonight's episode promised all that and more. The producers had been hyping it for days, a segment dedicated to the newly released JFK assassination files, a topic that had ignited speculation across the country. But what really had the audience buzzing was the guest, Karoline Leavitt. A rising star in conservative circles, known for her sharp wit, fearless approach, and ability to dismantle even the most seasoned political commentators. Young, articulate, and unshakable, Karoline had made a name for herself by challenging the mainstream media's narratives and winning. Her opponent for the night? Jonathan Reed, a veteran political host with a reputation for aggressive questioning, smug one-liners, and a thinly veiled disdain for anything remotely conservative. He had steamrolled plenty of Republican guests before, cutting them off mid-sentence, twisting their words, and turning interviews into public takedowns. Tonight, he was sure it would be no different. Behind the scenes, Karoline sat in the green room, scrolling through the latest reports on her phone. She had done her homework. The JFK files were explosive: CIA operations, withheld documents, unanswered questions. Yet the media had already begun downplaying them, dismissing decades of speculation as baseless conspiracy theories. Karoline knew exactly what was about to happen. Reed would try to paint her as another right-wing conspiracy theorist. He'd laugh off the revelations, mock any skepticism toward the government's official story, and attempt to turn her into a spectacle for his audience. But what he didn't know? Karolina had every fact, every document, and every historical precedent ready to fire back. The producer's voice crackled over the earpiece. 30 seconds, Karoline. You're up." She took one last sip of water, adjusted the mic clip to her blazer, and exhaled slowly. The game was about to begin. She wasn't just ready for battle, she was built for it. The intro music swelled, the cameras panned, and the studio audience leaned forward in anticipation. At the sleek glass desk, Jonathan Reed flashed his signature grin, confident, condescending, ready to pounce. "Good evening, everyone," he began smoothly. "Tonight, we're diving into one of the most talked-about news stories of the week, the newly declassified JFK assassination files." He paused for effect, glancing at the camera. "Now, if you ask certain people, they'll tell you these documents change everything, that they prove some grand cover-up, that somehow the deep state has been hiding the truth from us for decades." The smirk grew wider. Of course, for those of us who live in reality, these files are nothing more than a collection of old, disjointed memos, a historical footnote with no real impact on today's world. A few chuckles rippled through the studio audience. Karoline said nothing. Not yet. Reed turned toward her, resting his hands on the desk like a professor about to correct an unruly student. To discuss this, we're joined by Karoline Leavitt, political commentator, former White House staffer, and, let's be honest, someone who's never met a government agency she didn't think was hiding something. More laughter. A well-rehearsed joke designed to set the tone. Karoline didn't blink. "Karoline," Reed continued, "why is the right so obsessed with these JFK files? What exactly do you think these documents prove? Because from where I'm sitting, this just looks like another excuse to push conspiracy theories." He leaned back, arms crossed, radiating smug confidence. It was the opening move: set the narrative, make her defensive, dismiss the files as nonsense before she even had a chance to speak. Karoline, however, was already 5 steps ahead. She tilted her head slightly, the faintest smirk forming at the edge of her lips. Then, calmly, deliberately, she leaned in. "Well, Jonathan," she said, her voice smooth and controlled, "it's interesting that you call this a conspiracy theory, when just this week The documents confirmed that the CIA had direct knowledge of Lee Harvey Oswald before the assassination and deliberately withheld it from investigators. The audience went silent. Reed's smile faltered, just for a second. But Karoline wasn't done. She adjusted her mic, locking eyes with the host. "You're saying that's not worth talking about?" The tension in the studio shifted. Jonathan Reed had just walked into a trap, and Karoline was about to spring it. The silence hung in the air for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the weight of Karoline's words to settle. The tension was palpable. Even the studio audience, conditioned to laugh on cue, remained still, their anticipation thickening. Karoline knew she had the room. Reed, on the other hand, was already shifting in his seat. His polished bravado hadn't slipped completely, but there was something behind his eyes, an awareness that he wasn't in control of this exchange. She pressed forward. "You see, Jonathan, these files don't just suggest a cover-up," she continued, flipping through the stack of papers in front of her. "They confirm it. For decades, we were told Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, that he was a disgruntled former Marine with communist sympathies who just happened to assassinate a sitting U.S. president." She paused, lifting her gaze to meet his. "But the newly released CIA documents prove otherwise." Reed's fingers drummed lightly against the desk, a small tell. Karoline pulled out a specific page from the report. "This is a memo dated October 10th, 1963, a month before Kennedy's assassination. It clearly states that the CIA had been tracking Oswald for over a year prior. Not only that, but they deliberately withheld information from both the FBI and the Warren Commission." A murmur rippled through the studio audience. She held up another page. "And let's not forget Operation Northwoods, a declassified Pentagon plan from 1962 that literally outlined false flag attacks to justify war, including plans to stage assassinations." She let the words sink in before delivering the gut punch. "So let me ask you, Jonathan, if the government was planning to stage assassinations for political gain in 1962, why is it so crazy to question what happened in 1963? Reed opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time, he hesitated. Karoline knew she had drawn first blood, but Reed wasn't about to surrender. He had one move left, deflection, and she was more than ready for it. Reed chuckled. Not a genuine laugh, but the kind politicians use when they are about to dismiss something they don't want to address. "Oh, Karoline," he sighed, shaking his head, "I have to hand it to you. You certainly know how to spin a story." Karoline didn't react. She had seen this move before. Mock, belittle, dodge. Reed leaned forward, tapping his pen against the desk. "You know what all of this sounds like?" he asked, his grin returning. "Classic right-wing conspiracy theory. You're telling me that after all these years, after every investigation, after the Warren Commission report, after decades of historical research, that somehow you and a handful of so-called skeptics have cracked the case?" A few forced laughs from the audience, planted supporters. Karoline just smiled. "You mean the same Warren Commission report that relied on data the CIA and FBI knowingly falsified?" Reed's expression stiffened. Karoline turned to the audience. "The report that completely ignored key witness testimonies, that conveniently lost evidence and never explained why so many people tied to Oswald and the case ended up dead under mysterious circumstances?" She turned back to Reed. "Jonathan, let me remind you, the CIA admitted in a 2013 memo that they deliberately used the term conspiracy theory to discredit critics of the Warren Commission." She leaned in slightly. "In other words, you're repeating their exact playbook." The audience reacted. Gasps, a low murmur, even a few claps. Reed's smirk faltered, just for a second. Karoline continued, her voice steady. "See, that's the problem. Every time new information comes out, every time the government is caught lying, people like you don't want to talk about the facts. You just want to label anyone who questions them A conspiracy theorist? She tapped the files in front of her. But facts aren't conspiracy theories, and no amount of laughing it off changes what's in these documents. Reed glanced down at his notes, stalling. He was losing control of the narrative, and he knew it. Karoline had dismantled his deflection. And now? She was about to bury his credibility for good. Reed was on the ropes, and Karoline knew it. The smugness on his face had been replaced by something else, uncertainty. But she wasn't here for a draw. She was here to end the debate. Calmly, she reached beneath the desk and pulled out a thick stack of documents. The paper rustled in the microphone, a deliberate sound, one that signaled she had receipts. "Jonathan, let's stop pretending this is some baseless theory," she said, flipping to the top page. "Let's talk about facts." The audience leaned in. She lifted the first document. This is a declassified memo from the CIA's counterintelligence staff, dated October 10, 1963. It clearly states that the CIA had been tracking Lee Harvey Oswald long before the assassination, not after, before. Reed's lips parted slightly, but he said nothing. Karoline continued, holding up another document. "And here's another, a CIA memo from 1978 admitting that sensitive information about Oswald had been withheld from the Warren Commission. They buried evidence, on purpose." The tension in the room shifted. Then she went in for the kill shot. This report, recently declassified, confirms that high-ranking CIA officials were monitoring Oswald's every move in the months leading up to Kennedy's assassination. A murmur rippled through the crowd. That detail changed everything. Karoline leaned back slightly, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "For decades, the official story has been that Oswald was a lone wolf," she continued, "a random, disgruntled ex-Marine who acted on his own. But these files, they prove the government knew exactly who he was, and they were watching him. They had files on him, and they did nothing." The audience gasped. Even the most skeptical viewers could feel it now. This was real. Reed swallowed hard, his composure cracking. He glanced at his producers, clearly searching for an escape. Karoline smiled. She had him. But rather than admitting he was losing, Reed changed tactics. And in doing so, he walked right into Karoline's next trap. Reed exhaled sharply. His usual bag of tricks, mockery, dismissal, and smug interruptions hadn't worked. So now he tried a new strategy. He waved a hand dismissively, chuckling nervously. "Look, Karoline," he said, forcing a smile. "No one is saying the government is perfect. The U.S. has always had its fair share of transparency issues." Karoline tilted her head. "Oh? So you're admitting the government lies to the public?" Reed's face froze. A beat of silence. Then he stuttered. I mean, governments around the world have—" No, Karoline interrupted smoothly, holding up a hand. "You just admitted it. The U.S. government lies to its own people." The audience reacted, a mix of gasps and low murmurs. Reed shifted in his chair, flustered. "Well, look," he backtracked, grasping for control. "There's a difference between mistakes made in intelligence gathering and a full-blown conspiracy to cover up a president's assassination." Karoline didn't blink. "Jonathan, which is it?" she asked, voice steady. "Either our government has a history of misleading the public, or you believe they've been honest about JFK's death. You can't have it both ways." Reed stayed silent, because he had no good answer. Karoline let the moment breathe, let the audience feel the contradiction hanging in the air. Then, with a slight smirk, she delivered the final dagger. "You know what's interesting?" she said. "Every time new declassified information comes out, it turns out the so-called conspiracy theorists were actually right." Reed visibly clenched his jaw. The room had turned. The audience wasn't on his side anymore. And Karoline? She was just getting started. Reed had spent the last few minutes scrambling for control, but Karoline wasn't about to let up. Now she was about to pull the curtain back, on the very industry propping him up. She flipped to another document in her stack and set it on the desk, tapping it twice. "You know what's fascinating, Jonathan," she said, her tone smooth but sharp. "The way the mainstream media has spent the last 60 years burying this story." Reed shifted in his chair. Karoline smirked. There it was. "You see, the problem isn't just what's in these newly declassified files. It's the fact that the media has actively ignored, dismissed, or ridiculed anyone who ever dared to question the official story." She pulled out another stack of papers and held them up. "These are archived reports from journalists, respected, award-winning reporters who tried to investigate inconsistencies in the JFK assassination story. Do you know what happened to them, Jonathan?" Reed didn't answer. Karoline answered for him. They were either blacklisted, fired, or completely erased from the conversation. The studio audience was dead silent. She continued, flipping to another document. "Take Dorothy Kilgallen, for example, a top investigative journalist who was covering the JFK case. She said she was going to blow it wide open. She had evidence. Then suddenly, she was found dead." Another pause. "The official story? Overdose. But her notes? The ones on JFK? Gone. Disappeared." Reed's jaw tightened. Karoline leaned forward slightly. "And let's not forget Jim Garrison, the New Orleans DA, who tried to reopen the case. The media painted him as a lunatic, even though he had credible witnesses. His career was destroyed." She let that sink in. Reed opened his mouth, desperate to regain ground. "Karoline, come on," he scoffed, though his voice wasn't as steady as before. "You're acting like the media is some big conspiracy machine, deliberately covering up history." Karoline arched an eyebrow. "Oh, you mean like they did with Hunter Biden's laptop? Like they did when they called the lab leak theory misinformation? Like when they buried the Twitter files?" Reed's face went pale. "You want to talk about disinformation, Jonathan?" she asked. "The media doesn't just get stories wrong, they actively suppress them. And the JFK files? They've been doing it for 60 years. The host looked rattled. He wasn't expecting this turn. And now? Karoline was about to shatter his last defense. Reed needed a lifeline. His best bet? Make Karoline look like a conspiracy theorist. "So let me get this straight," he said, attempting to regain his smug tone. "You think the government and the media have been conspiring together for decades? That sounds a little far-fetched, don't you think?" Karoline just smiled. "Far-fetched?" she repeated. "You want historical proof? Fine. Let's talk about past government cover-ups." She flipped to a new page in her stack of documents. "Let's start with the Gulf of Tonkin incident." Reed's eyes flickered. "You know, the event that was used to justify America's full-scale involvement in Vietnam. The official story was that North Vietnamese forces attacked U.S. ships in open waters. Turns out, it was a lie, completely fabricated," the audience murmured. Karoline continued, her voice steady and confident. "Then we have Operation Mockingbird, an actual documented CIA program where the government paid journalists to push pro-government propaganda and suppress unfavorable stories." She turned slightly, looking toward the audience. "Remind me again, Jonathan, who do you work for?" Laughter erupted. Reed's face darkened. But Karoline wasn't finished. She tapped the last document. "And of course, we can't forget COINTELPRO, the FBI's covert operation targeting political figures, activists, and journalists. You know, spying on them, spreading false information, framing people for crimes. They even tried to blackmail Martin Luther King Jr. into killing himself." Reed was speechless. Karoline sat back, folding her hands. "Now, Jonathan," she said, voice dripping with mock innocence, "if they lied about all of this, why wouldn't they lie about JFK?" Reed had no answer because he knew she was right. Reed was sweating now. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. The usual smug confidence that carried him through most debates had evaporated. Karoline had come armed with facts, history, and evidence, And worst of all, the viewers at home were seeing it. He had one option left: change the subject. Reed straightened his papers, forcing a smirk. The mask was slipping, but he wasn't ready to surrender. "Karoline," he said, his tone suddenly more condescending, "isn't it just a little convenient that the far right is obsessed with deep state conspiracies?" The audience stiffened. They could feel the pivot. Reed continued, pressing his advantage before Karoline could cut in. "I mean, let's be honest here," he said, gesturing broadly. "This is the same crowd that thinks the election was stolen, that COVID was a hoax, that climate change isn't real." Karoline tilted her head, amused. "And now," Reed barreled on, desperate to regain ground, "you want us to believe the CIA was secretly orchestrating a massive government cover-up for 6 decades? Come on, Karoline." He leaned back, crossing his arms. There it was. Reed wasn't debating anymore. He was attacking her, trying to paint her as an extremist, a conspiracy theorist, a partisan hack, anything but credible. The problem? The audience saw right through it. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd, not in Reed's favor. Even moderate viewers could sense the shift. This wasn't about JFK anymore. It was about labeling and silencing people who questioned the government. Karoline smirked. She had been waiting for this moment. Now she was about to spring the trap. Karoline leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk, calm, confident, in control. "So, Jonathan," she said, her voice steady, "you're saying that questioning the government's honesty makes someone far right?" Reed blinked. For the first time in the debate, he hesitated. He had walked right into it. The audience shifted again. This was no longer a left versus right argument. This was about trusting the government. And Reed had just implied that anyone who doubted official narratives was some kind of radical. The moderates in the room? The independent thinkers? The people who might not even like Karoline, but distrust the government just as much. He had just alienated all of them. Karoline had let the moment breathe, then delivered the final blow. "Tell me, Jonathan," she continued, her voice light but firm, "were the people who doubted the government about Watergate far-right extremists?" Reed's jaw clenched. "What about the people who questioned the Iraq War and the lies about weapons of mass destruction?" she added. "Were they right-wing conspiracy theorists too?" Silence. The trap had snapped shut. The audience wasn't with him anymore. Karoline sat back, folding her hands. "The reality is," she said, letting her words sink in, "people don't trust the government because the government has lied, over and over. If you want to dismiss that as a right-wing talking point, be my guest." She gestured to the crowd. "But good luck convincing everyone else in this room." Reed's face was stone. Because he knew it, he had lost. The room was silent now. Reed was still trying to recover from his mistake, but Karoline wasn't going to let up. She had led him exactly where she wanted, and now it was time to finish this. She pulled one last document from her stack and set it down with a crisp thud. "This," she said, "is where the official story completely falls apart." Reed shifted in his chair. She slid the document forward, tapping the top page. "These are FBI documents, declassified just last year. They show that key witnesses in the JFK investigation were pressured, threatened, and, in some cases, silenced." A few people in the audience gasped. Reed opened his mouth, but Karoline raised a hand. "Before you call this another conspiracy theory, let's go over a few names," she said, flipping through the pages. She cleared her throat. Jean Hill, one of the closest eyewitnesses to the shooting. She claimed shots came from the grassy knoll. The Warren Commission told her she was mistaken. The FBI changed her testimony. She glanced at Reed. He was staring at her now, silent. Karoline continued. "Roger Craig, a Dallas deputy sheriff. He reported seeing Oswald get into a different car after the shooting, contradicting the lone gunman theory. He later had multiple accidents, was shot at, and eventually died under suspicious circumstances." The room wasn't just tense anymore, it was charged. She leaned in slightly. And then there's David Ferry, a man directly linked to the accused co-conspirators. He was scheduled to testify before the grand jury, and then found dead in his apartment. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Karoline sat back, locking eyes with Reed. "Explain that." Reed's jaw tightened. He had nothing. His usual smirk, gone. His confidence, shattered. The host of a primetime political show, speechless on live television. Karoline didn't need to say another word. She had won. The shift was palpable. The audience had started this segment expecting another partisan debate, another shouting match between a conservative guest and a liberal host. But that's not what they got. They got evidence. They got history. They got facts that couldn't be ignored. And now, even the people who had walked into this believing the official JFK story were starting to reconsider. Karoline could see it in their faces. The slow nods, the whispered conversations, even the way some of them glanced at Reed, waiting for a response he clearly didn't have. For the first time all night, Reed wasn't in control. The energy in the room had shifted. He must have felt it too, because he tried, one last time, to regain ground. "Well," he said, forcing a laugh that no one echoed, "this is certainly an interesting interpretation of history, Karoline." She smirked. "Oh, it's not my interpretation, Jonathan. It's just what's in the files." The audience reacted immediately, a ripple of agreement, a few claps. Even the staunchest skeptics in the room were rethinking what they thought they knew. Karoline let the reaction settle before delivering the final line. "The problem isn't that people believe in conspiracies, Jonathan." She gestured toward her stack of declassified government documents. "The problem is that the government keeps giving us a reason to." The audience erupted. Applause, cheers. A few people even stood up. Reed? He just sat there. Because for the first time in his career, he wasn't the one controlling the narrative. Karoline was. And she had just changed everything. Reed was drowning and he knew it. The audience had turned against him. His usual tactics, mocking, dismissing, deflecting, had failed. Karoline had him cornered, and now he was desperate for an out. He shuffled his notes, stalling. Then, with an exaggerated sigh, he forced a half-hearted chuckle and leaned back in his chair. "Look," he said, trying to reclaim his authority, "I'll admit the government isn't perfect. Mistakes have been made. But what you're suggesting, that there's been a massive coordinated cover-up for decades." He shook his head. "That's just a stretch." Karoline tilted her head, feigning curiosity. "A stretch?" she echoed. Reed nodded quickly, sensing a lifeline. "Yes, a stretch," he said, regaining a bit of his earlier smugness. "Just because there are inconsistencies doesn't mean there's a grand conspiracy. Governments make errors all the time. Bureaucracy is messy. But this?" He waved his hand at her stack of documents. "It doesn't prove anything beyond mismanagement and maybe some sloppy reporting back in the 60s. The audience was dead silent, waiting for Karoline's response. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. Her next words would end him. "How much evidence do you need?" Reed's smirk faltered. Karoline didn't stop. "Because, Jonathan," she said, voice measured but sharp, "so far I've shown you declassified government memos proving they lied to investigators, suppressed witness testimonies, and even had CIA operatives monitoring Oswald before the assassination, yet you still refuse to even consider the possibility that they covered something up." She gestured to the audience. "Tell me, if this much evidence existed for literally anything else, would you dismiss it so easily?" Reed's eyes darted around the room, looking for support. He found none. The audience was waiting for his response. He had none. Karoline had stripped away every excuse, every spin, every bit of false confidence. And now it was time for the final shot. Karoline let the silence linger. The weight of her question hung in the air. Reed wasn't smiling anymore. His hands, which had been calm and controlled at the start, were now clenching his cue cards. He opened his mouth, then hesitated. Karoline saw the crack, and she went in for the kill. She leaned back in her chair, composed, unbothered, and then asked the only question that mattered. If these files aren't a big deal, then why did they keep them hidden for 60 years? The audience froze. Reed's face drained of color. He blinked. He stammered. He opened his mouth again, but nothing came out, because there was no good answer. Karoline held his gaze, her smirk barely visible. The audience? They saw it. They knew. The man who had mocked, belittled, and dismissed her for the last 30 minutes now had nothing left to say. And then, like a thunderclap, the crowd erupted. Cheers, applause. A few people even stood up. Reed shifted in his chair, stunned. He wasn't used to losing control of the conversation. He wasn't used to being the one with no comeback. But tonight, he had no choice but to sit there and take it. Karoline didn't need to say anything else. She had just ended the debate, and everyone in the room knew it. It started with a single clip. A 2-minute segment ripped straight from the live broadcast, showing Karoline Leavitt dismantling Jonathan Reed in real time. The caption? Karoline Leavitt exposes the biggest JFK cover-up on live TV. Host left speechless. Within minutes, the video was everywhere. Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, Telegram. Millions watched as Reed stammered, hesitated, and ultimately fell silent when Karoline hit him with the final question. If these files aren't a big deal, then why did they keep them hidden for 60 years? The reaction? Explosive. She just took down the entire mainstream media narrative in one sentence. This is why they fear people who actually do their homework. I wasn't even into JFK conspiracies, but damn, now I'm interested. The hashtag number JFK files started trending worldwide. News articles poured in. Breaking: Karoline Leavitt shuts down mainstream host in fiery debate on JFK files. Karoline Leavitt humiliates liberal host over government lies. Media scrambling to cover up the biggest TV debate of the year. But it didn't stop there. Other conservative commentators jumped on the story. They clipped and replayed the debate frame by frame, dissecting every moment where Karoline exposed the cracks in the official narrative. Meanwhile, the mainstream media panicked. The same networks that spent decades downplaying the JFK files were now forced to address them. Some outlets tried damage control. Karoline Leavitt's misleading claims about JFK files spark online debate. Right-wing media distorts newly declassified documents. Here's what they really say. But it was too late. The story was out. People were reading the documents for themselves. People were questioning the official narrative. And for the first time in decades, the mainstream media wasn't controlling the conversation. Karoline? Her reputation as a fearless debater was cemented. Political commentators called her a rising powerhouse. Some even compared her to Tucker Carlson and Ben Shapiro. Unshakable, razor sharp, impossible to defeat in an argument. But most importantly, the JFK files were finally being discussed, not in underground forums, not in late-night conspiracy theory circles, by the mainstream, by people who, just a week ago, never thought twice about who really killed JFK. And as Karoline watched the headlines roll in, her phone buzzing non-stop with interview requests, she smiled. She hadn't just won a debate. She had forced the truth into the light. And this was only the beginning. Want to hear more of this? Then click on the video on the right-hand side, which is even more insane.